We are good to go, sir.
All right, okay. Um, Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the next installment of the Literature of Sustainability series, Reading, Writing, and the SDGs. We have been doing this since February, as many of you know. Several of you have come back on many occasions to listen to our experts. Today, we focus on SDG 9, Industry, Innovation, and Infrastructure. And we are delighted to have with us Professor Clare Pettitt of the University of Cambridge, who, at least in her case, has been is here at a reasonable hour at her time, unlike some of our speakers who were up, as I was telling her, at the crack of dawn to speak to us. Welcome all of you, and a more formal welcome to the event by Atul, who is the project assistant with the UNESCO chair, and also welcoming you all with me is Professor Anna Kurian. Over to you, Atul.
Thank you, sir, and welcome everyone. If I may introduce Professor Pettitt to you. Clare Pettitt holds the Grace II Chair in the Faculty of English at Cambridge University and is a Fellow of the Emmanuel College. Her research is in the long 19th century. She is currently finishing a trilogy which investigates the concept of seriality as it came to underpin social and political life in Europe and its colonies in ways that persist today. This research focuses on print culture alongside emerging digital technologies and media forms in the 19th century. She also works on the history of the material book and the historical production of ideas of authorship, ownership, originality, and authority. Her books include Patent Inventions, Intellectual Property and the Victorian Novel, and Dr. Livingstone, I presume, Missionaries, Journalists, Explorers, and Empire, Serial Forms, The Unfinished Project of Modernity, 1815 to 1848, which won the North American Victorian Studies Association Book Prize and was co-winner of the British Academy's Rosemary Crochet Prize and of the Esprit Prize, the European Society for Periodical Studies. Serial Revolutions, 1848, Writing, Politics, Form, came out in 2022. Pettitt is a general editor of the Cambridge University Press Studies in 19th Century Literature and Culture monograph series and an editor of Cambridge Quarterly. Her talk today is titled Groundless Empire and Grounded Resistance. Over to you, Professor Pettitt.
Oh, thank you. That was a lovely introduction. I want to thank Pramod and Anna particularly for inviting me to give this talk. Thank you so much. It's very exciting for me to be speaking in India, although I kind of wish I was actually in India, of course, but speaking to India, as it were. It's a fantastic series. It's an important series, and I'm very honoured to be in it. And thanks to all of you who've come to listen as well. Thank you. So I did give a content warning on the flyer, but I'll just reiterate this. The paper does contain nothing terribly graphic, but some descriptions of colonial violence. And I've given British place names for Indian cities when I'm discussing the colonial 19th century. So that was just a decision I made. Okay. So I thought I should probably start by quickly situating today's talk in the research that I'm currently doing. Some of it you've just heard about in the introduction. I'm 2/3 of the way through a trilogy on the idea of the serial and seriality in the 19th century. So when they think about seriality, most literary scholars probably think first about serialized fiction. It's often the serialized novels of Dickens, in fact, that spring immediately to mind, I find. But my book set out to enlarge our thinking about seriality by starting to think about it as not just a literary, but also as a political, historical, and social category. So the first book of the trilogy, Serial Forms, came out in 2020. And in it, I set out the fundamental premise that underpins all three books, that close attention to serial media forms can reveal a changing model of social and political time across the 19th century, and that seriality can help us think in fresh ways about conventional literary forms. And I'm also arguing across all the three books that seriality is starting to code information long before computerization, and that the digital age, therefore, really begins much earlier than we tend to think. So let's see if the slides are working. Can everybody see this? So Serial Forms, here it is, goes back to 1815 and the end of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe to a time before mass communication or mass culture, and argues that while the rhythms of seriality in the early 19th century did not create political subjects out of people overnight, they did crucially start the feeling of being part of a daily politics for more and more British people. In serial forms, I argue that, as it says on the slide, seriality is a kind of knowledge that is a kind of knowledge that is political, bodily, and historical, a knowledge about being in time. In serial forms, I knew I wanted to move away from readings of established classics and open up the archive to see what other kinds of evidence I could find about daily practices and encounters with print and spectacle. Deliberately focusing on London, I wanted to write about the bodily experience of the city's rhythms for those people who were too poor fully to participate in a daily news culture because of the heavy news taxes and political censorship at the time, which was even more brutal after the Peterloo massacre in 1819. What did the news mean to the many people who were illiterate or semi-literate and anyway couldn't afford a daily newspaper and depended on other kinds of cheap printed material? I explored an alternative ecosystem of cheap periodicals, broadsheets, songs, panoramas, dioramas, opera sets, exhibited paintings at the Egyptian Hall, theatrical spectacles, cheap toys, and shows such as the ubiquitous erupting Vesuvius shows. Here is a fake Vesuvius erupting at the Surrey Zoological Gardens, for example. I gathered together all this ephemera to think about the remediation, reserialization, and the popular reach of, for example, the works of Walter Scott, Byron, and Bulwer Lytton. I show how multiple remediations of literary works made them live, porous, novel, and playable for new constituencies. These material practices of seriality were open-ended and offered new and suggestive ways of inserting oneself into historical time, delivering new forms of knowledge, and, I suggest, at least some pieces of the apparatus of citizenship. Now, as a result of this work on politics, representation, and seriality in the 1820s and 1830s, I realized that I'd accidentally started to write a separate book about 1848, because that series of European revolutions just kept calling to me as so important as a matrix of social, political, and cultural modernity, and so weirdly underregarded in Anglophone literary studies. So the second book in the series, Serial Revolutions, 1848, Writing, Politics, Form, maintains that 1848 was a crucial turning point for popular political representation globally, and that without the new consciousness of interconnectedness brought about by a serial permeability of texts, ideas, and politics, the series of revolutions of 1848 would never have happened. And I'm now working on the third and final volume of the trilogy, which I'm currently calling the digital serial, Art, Literature, Politics, 1848 to 1914. This will examine technologies enable control at a distance, while also producing unexpected and novel forms of resistance. In telling the story of the prehistory of the digital, I set out to show how the digital emerged from an unfair and uneven world with and alongside new systems of racial coding. It's perhaps not really surprising then that our new media today continue to perpetuate those unexamined inequalities. The racist and sexist algorithms were there right from the start. This talk comes from very new and rather rough and unhewn work for this digital book. I'm going to focus today on a particular example of what Elika Burma and Donald Davis have called planned violence, the introduction of the electric telegraph into India under colonial British rule. While infrastructure in the global north is generally supposed to remain invisible, reducible to nothing more than a taken for granted background hum, the colonial administration's infrastructural development often functioned as one of the most spectacular showcases of imperial modernity, and was proudly displayed as an index of so-called civilization and modernity. I'm interested in showing how writers, both British and Indian, paid particular attention to the uneasy relationship of the telegraph to the Indian landscape, and how the Indian environment came to register a kind of anti-colonial resistance in their work. I argue that both the colonial and anti-colonial literature of this period is self-consciously infrastructural in its identification of what Sarah Nuttall has called the force of the literary to offer us a form of the radically possible. So the first section is actually not about the telegraph, but about the International Postal Service. And I'm particularly interested in the overland service to India in the 19th century, British service. Towards the end of Elizabeth Gaskell's 1850s serial Cranford, the narrator Mary Smith posts a letter in the village postbox The letter is addressed to a village in India. It's this letter that will eventually bring the long-lost Peter Jenkins home in an episode called A Happy Return, and thereby enable Gaskell to wrap up her series with the final episode, Peace to Cranford. So this is Mary Smith posting the letter. At last I got the address, spelt by sound, and very queer it looked. I dropped the letter in the post on my way home, and then for a minute I stood looking at the wooden pane with the gaping slit, that's the post box, which divided me from the letter but a moment ago in my hand. It was gone from me like life, never to be recalled. It would get tossed about on the sea and stained with sea waves, perhaps, and be carried among palm trees and scented with all tropical fragrance. The little piece of paper, but an hour ago so familiar and commonplace, had set out on its race to the strange wild countries beyond the Ganges. Mary's reverie in front of the gaping slit of the letterbox is brief because she's in a hurry. Quotes, "I could not afford to lose much time on this speculation, and I hastened home," she says. Nevertheless, the narrative pauses for long enough to squint across continents in an attempt to follow the race of that little piece of paper to India. Cranford is set in the early 1840s, just after the reform in Britain, which inaugurated an accelerated postal system, the uniform penny post, establishing and the quotes on the slide, a regular, rapid and frequent transmission of the mails from and to the provinces. The Cranford postbox, like all the postboxes at country post offices and out of the way villages, is one small node in a rapidly expanding international postal network. Mary Smith lives in the large industrial town of Drumble, which is Gaskell's proxy for Manchester. So she stays in touch with her friends in the village of Cranford by post and has, quotes, vibrated all my life between Drumble and Cranford on the train. The two places, despite their distance in culture and apparently in time, being, quotes, distant only 20 miles on a railroad. The provincial village was infrastructurally embedded by the new railway and postal services, and through Mary Smith's shuttling back and forth in Cranford, Gaskell rehearses what Josephine McDonough has called the conflations of distance and intimacy that structure the provincial mode. 18 months before Cranford's first appearance in its pages, the inaugural number of Dickens's Household Words ran its first process article, as Dickens came to call them, about the General Post Office at St Martin's le Grand in London. Designed by Robert Smirke and opened in 1829, this was an imposing Grecian-style edifice with Ionic porticos built to reflect its important role as, quotes, the great metropolitan heart of communication with the whole world. The General Post Office became the object of considerable fascination and repeated representation. For example, George Hicks's 1860 genre painting, The General Post Office, 1 minute to 6, takes us inside Smirke's building to see the rush to catch the 6 p.m. post and the delivery of the evening editions of the newspapers for postal distribution. Part of the fascination of this recurrent set-piece scene was its appeal to the infrastructural imagination of the relentless flow and acceleration of postal traffic. Dickens and W.H. Wills described the same scene in Household Words in terms of a storm coming on by fast degrees. It was just then drizzling, so they're in the post office, the very same post office that we've just been looking at. It was then drizzling newspapers. The great window of that department being thrown open, the first black fringe of a thundercloud of newspapers impending over the post office was discharging itself fitfully, now in large drops, now in little, now in sudden plumps, now stopping altogether. By degrees, it began to run hard. By fast degrees, the storm came on harder and harder until it blew, rained, hailed, snowed newspapers. So the newspapers are all being thrown through this window into the waiting railway carriages. They get loaded onto the railway carriages to be distributed around the provinces. I think it's interesting that the idea of weather is used here, weather being a global system that creates local consequences. And it's used here to figure acceleration towards a deadline, the scale of accumulation and the speed of sorting and dispatch. As, quotes, in the General Post Office, business is going on at all hours of the day and night. The loss of a minute would be felt by thousands at a distance of thousands of miles. Revealingly, one commentator tells us that the crowd in the central London post office is, quotes, much more exciting than half the emerts which take place on the continent, considerably cheaper and much more safe. The connection to the recent European revolutions here, I think, is significant. As Bernhard Siegert says of the 1840 penny post, quotes, "The postage stamp prevented revolution because it was the revolution." It was, however, also the counter-revolution. The everyday flow in an information network was managed by the General Post Office, and the General Post Office had long been part of the British state's counterinsurgency apparatus. And as we shall see, the conjoined postal and telegraph systems would continue to be imagined into the 1850s and 1860s as a frontline tool of both domestic and imperial control and surveillance. Trains, horses, and human postal workers were all integrated into the communications relays. Not only horse traffic, but all communications in the 19th century relied upon relay systems to ensure the maintenance of stable and constant speed for post, rail, and telegraph. Yet while a relay system makes long-distance travel or transmission possible, each stage or point of interchange and connection is attended by considerable risk. Each stage is a switching station, or, quotes, a matrix of locales in which circulation can be interrupted. There's the risk that the message or the passenger is misrouted, or that they're irretrievably lost, or that the system breaks down and fails to continue. The connection is missed, leaving the passenger or the information stranded. Speed can decelerate to a dead halt. Information or property can be misappropriated. If they are delayed, messages can quickly become meaningless. Communication can be broken and control at a distance can be compromised. Well, readers of Cranford know that Mary Smith's letter to the Aga Jenkins did eventually make its way from the Cranford village post box to the fictional Indian village of Chunda Abadad. It may indeed have arrived, quotes, stained with sea waves, as the British postal system encompassed a, quote, vast system of water posts. The foreign mails have at their command a fleet of steamers, threading the coral reefs of the lone Antille, skirting the western coast of South America, touching weekly at the ports of the United States, and bi-monthly traversing the Indian Ocean. The Indian Post arrived every fortnight or thereabouts, not always regularly, for there are winds and tides and other contingencies by land and water. Once it arrived at the Indian port of Calcutta, Mary Smith's letter would be carried on by train and then delivered to the village by postal runners. In an 1858 article on the Dorkwallas, or postmen of Bengal, the Illustrated London News explained that the Dorkwallas, who usually belong to the coolie caste, carry their burdens at a smart trot, a distance of from 8 to 10 miles. Having completed their run, which is achieved in about an hour and a quarter, the bags and etc. are handed to a relay, who are waiting in expectation of their arrival at the next dork house or shed, for it is in most cases little better than 4 mud walls and a thatched roof. There they wait for the down dork and set off again in a fast relay system. This account, designed for the metropolitan readers of the Illustrated London News, describes a satisfyingly smooth system based on the imperial principles of speed and punctuality. Likewise, Gaskell's Mrs. Brown in Cranford, also known as Signora Brunoni, walks with seeming ease, quotes, from station to station, from Indian village to Indian village, carrying my child. But on the ground, it was quite impossible to standardise speeds and mileage and to mitigate the risks of passage. And even the British employed post office officials recognised this. As Kipling puts it in his 1886 poem, The Overland Mail, is the torrent in spate? He must ford it or swim. Has the rain wrecked the road? He must climb by the cliff. Running through tangled undergrowth in often dangerous weather conditions, at night the runners were joined by a torch carrier to ward off tigers and robbers. This is stanza 2 of Kipling's poem, The Overland Mail. With a jingle of bells as the dusk gathers in, he turns to the footpath that heads up the hill, the bags on his back and the cloth round his chin, and tucked in his waistbelt the post office bill. Dispatched on this date as received by the rail, per runner 2 bags of the Overland Mail. The original title of Kipling's poem was in fact Her Majesty's Mail, but in the manuscript Kipling has crossed out Her Majesty's and replaced it with The Overland, thereby rerouting the focus of the poem onto the resistant materiality of the Indian terrain. From aloe to rose oak, from rose oak to fir, from level to upland, from upland to crest, from rice field to rock ridge, from rock ridge to spur. No Indian aloes or rose oaks appear in Gaskell's Cranford. Because the ground of India is not part of the groundwork of her story. There is actually a rhododendron in flower in the Jenkins's front garden, an import from the Himalayas, but India does not really figure. Daniel Wright has recently suggested that the groundwork of Thomas Hardy's novels is a field that is by definition without precise positionality, that doesn't cause the world that takes shape within it, but makes space for it. Gaskell does not make space for India in her tale, because when she was writing it, she was self-confessedly entirely ignorant of the country. In the summer of 1857, she wrote that, "I have never had a notion in my head about India in any way. I did not know that there were 3 presidencies, and as to whether the natives were white, green or blue, I knew nothing." All this was to change dramatically in 1857, when India, while it remained just as far away as ever on the map, was suddenly to loom very large in her life. Jean-Luc Nancy, writing about the ground of an image, has suggested that, quotes, "This is not merely a question of scale, it is a question of the relation to what is far and near, in a sense that is not simply that of measurable spatial distance." So I'm going to think a little tiny bit now about commerce and, well, I suppose the linkage between communication systems and commerce is what I'm interested in here. So in Cranford, after a spell as an enlisted naval officer and then as an East India Company soldier held prisoner at the siege of Rangoon, Peter has, quotes, "settled down as an indigo planter in the Indian village of Chunda Abadad." In 1891, the Bengali poet and Indian nationalist Rabindranath Tagore opened his short story The Postmaster in a post office in a small Indian village near an indigo plantation. For his first job, the postmaster came to the village of Ullappur. It was a very humble village. There was an indigo factory nearby, and the British manager had, with very much effort, established a new post office. The British owner of the indigo plantation, who needs a post office, reminds us of the contiguity of the extractive economy and imperial communications technologies. As Andrew Sartori explains, quotes, "The indigo industry, established in the late 18th century, had played a crucial role in transforming Bengal's peasantry into a cheap source of labour for the production of commodities for export." We see little of the indigo plantation in Tagore's story because, quotes, "the indigo agents and employees had hardly any spare time and were not suitable company for an educated man," or so the rather arrogant postmaster thinks. Cranford's Peter Jenkins is himself the British proprietor of an indigo plantation, although it's unclear whether there's a post office in his village of Chunda Abadad. Another literary Indian village postmaster, this time a real person and not a fictitious one, Dinabantu Mitra, met indigo workers firsthand when he worked in post offices in the rural areas of Orissa and Bengal. In 1860, just after the 1858 Indigo Revolt, Mitra published a play in Bengali about the brutality of the working conditions on the plantations, called Nil Dapan, or The Indigo Planting Mirror, a drama. It is not yet 3 years since the Saheb, that's the British man, took his lease of this place, and he's already ruined the whole village, laments one of the villagers in the first scene. The play was swiftly translated into English by British missionaries in India and sparked a lively debate in both Bengali and British newspapers about the injustices and cruelty of the indigo trade. Gaskell's Peter, her character Peter, is an Englishman whom she imagines living, quote, "right in the midst of natives," whereas Tagore's postmaster was a Calcutta boy, we're told, who feels like a fish out of water in a village like this. His office was in a dark, thatched hut. There was a pond next to it, scummed over with weeds, and jungle all around. These images, by the way, as I'm sure you've recognised, are stills from the very beautiful 1961 short film adaptation of Tagore's story, The Postmaster, directed by Bengali filmmaker Satyajit Ray. While Gaskell suggests that Peter is settled, quotes, in the country to whose inhabitants and modes of life he had become habituated, Tagore is interested in the Indian out of place. Tagore's post office is very quiet. The postmaster has, quotes, very little work to do, and his salary is accordingly meagre. We're asked to notice a lack of connectivity and speed. He's looked after by Ratan, a 12-year-old orphan girl of the village. He idly starts to teach Ratan to read, but when the rains come, he falls sick, and Ratan nurses him like a, quotes, mother until he is well again, when he abruptly leaves due to the unhealthiness of the place. Departing on the riverboat, he briefly experiences a pang of remorse for having left behind the, quotes, simple young village girl whom the world had abandoned. But he's already, quotes, detached by the current of the river, while Ratan remains in the stultifying village to, quotes, wander near the post office, weeping copiously. Tagore's interest in mobility is clearly ambivalent. Ratan's fate shows that the colonial communications and commerce, for all their promises of progress and education, leave most Indian subaltern subjects in place. The westernized postmaster Babu in this story tried to write poems about trees and clouds, but if a genie out of an Arab tale had come and cut down all the leafy trees overnight, made a road and blocked out the sky with rows of tall buildings, this half-dead, well-bred young man would have come alive again. The mobile, urban, educated postmaster leaves behind the semi-literate village orphan girl child. Indeed, Tagore's 1924 essay, City and Village, shows a keen awareness of the extractive colonialism driving the city-village divide in colonial India. The fatness of cities, Tagore posits, is sustained by a resource drain on villages to the point of physical and mental anemia. In 1853, Karl Marx also criticised, quotes, these idyllic village communities in India as promulgating an undignified, stagnatory and vegetative life, this passive sort of existence. But Tagore remains attached to the unit of the village, and he worries about Europeanization, the rising Babu class of European educated Indians, and about the damage that modernization and urbanization is causing to Indian life. Whereas Karl Marx insists that villages, quotes, restrained the human mind within the smallest possible compass, making it the unresisting tool of superstition, enslaving it beneath traditional rules, depriving it of all grandeur and historical energies. And he applauds imperial modernization. Whatever may have been the crimes of England, she was the unconscious tool of history in bringing about that social revolution. In their stories, these Indian writers reveal the rather different terms of their refusal of the techno-modernity of Europe. They also reveal the complexities of loyalty and loyalism to the British government. In his 1912 story, Dhaka Munshi, translated as The Postmaster, Fakar Mohan Senapati is sharply satirical about the values of European modernity. The protagonist of the story, Hari Singh, is a humble telegram delivery messenger who retires after being, quotes, posted to many post offices, big and small. A poor widower, he struggles to provide an English education to his only son, as ever since Gopal's birth, Singh had cherished a high hope Gopal would be sub-postmaster of a rural post office, or at least a village postmaster. But once Gopal is appointed sub-postmaster at Makrampur Rural Post Office, he becomes so intensely ashamed of his father, the old fellow without a shirt, that he, quote, deals 2 English blows on the old man's chest, significantly 2 English blows on the old man's chest, and throws him out of his house. Then, dressing up, taking the umbrella under the armpit, gyrating the stick, Babu, the son, walked off. The sick old man manages to walk back to his village, where he had 2 acres of landed property, which he'd entrusted to a farmer on sharecropping. And, quotes, Hari Singh lived in his village happily thereafter. The return to the village and to his land provides both subsistence and happiness, which is all that is required. The East India Company had been using telegraphic communication from the late 18th century. This mechanical semaphore telegraph tower was designed to ensure safe passage along the newly built Barrackpore invention of electrical relay technology in the late 1830s, long-distance electrical telegraphy became a real-world possibility. So the relay is a kind of switch which enables a weak signal to activate another circuit with a stronger signal, which allows onward transmission. And crucially, this means that the telegraph can maintain a constant speed of transmission. So the earthy ground level of the village, and of course India was a rural country of villages, was entirely traversed and ignored, indeed effectively bypassed, by a telegraph technology that swept over, oh sorry, that's an Indian one, yeah, that swept over it on another aerial plane, unobstructed by local bodies, concerns or needs, carrying swift coded communications between the British rulers. Information systems which had been porous, embodied and human were rejected by the new governance regime, which, quotes, disdained to pick up the gossip of courts through spies and old ladies. From mid-century, serial dots and dashes speedily transmitted communications in Morse code across vast distances. By 1856, what have I done with it? Sorry. Yeah, okay. By 1856, a line was built from Calcutta to Peshawar. Agra, the headquarters of the Northwest Province, was joined to Bombay, and Bombay was linked to Madras. This was a groundless communication system, literally, in that it used wires strung on poles above the ground, which remained indifferent to the terrain and local conditions of India. In the words of Deep Chowdhury, it was a linear network that linked the commercial and military nodes of the colonial state and had little to do with indigenous routes of trade and communication in the subcontinent. Telegraph technology separated communication from transportation for the first time, and thereby seemingly freed communication from the constraints of geography. The rollout on a world scale of a, quotes, electrical telegraph that can transmit messages with the speed of thought created a powerful fantasy of global speed and connectivity. As capitalism went digital, the telegraph was imagined as a fast and free-flowing medium which would sell and move commodities around the world with unprecedented speed. Customary property and rights, long respected in Indian society, were characterised as friction by the British, retarding Western progress and creating resistance, so slowing everything down. Friction and resistance are also electrical phenomena, which actually caused many problems for the British telegraph system in India, which was less perfect than it was made out to be. In his report of 1862, the Superintendent of Indian Telegraphs, William O'Shaughnessy, confessed that the Indian lines offer the only examples in the world of lines entirely devoid of insulation, the result of automatic transmission through 18 successive instruments, as on the line to Bombay, would not merely render the message unintelligible, but in the extreme cases, the message would, during transmission, entirely disappear. And even if they didn't entirely disappear, messages slowed and became indecipherable, telegraph wires broke or were attacked by bad actors or by wildlife or by weather. In a newspaper article, Kipling describes how during a flood, quotes, telegraph poles fall out of hillsides like old teeth, so that communication with the government in Simla grinds to a halt. For, quotes, there was 1.5 miles of raving, roaring Gugga River between the nearest telegraph engineer and the first broken telegraph post. This might prompt us to think and ponder anew. What is the relation between objects and knowledge, events and their mediation? And with this question in mind, I want to turn now to one event in particular, the Great Indian Rebellion of 1857. On 10th of May 1857, the first shot was fired in what was to become known as the Indian or Sepoy Mutiny, the Sepoy War, the Revolt of 1857, the Uprising of 1857, the Rebellion of 1857, the Great Rebellion, or the First Indian War of Independence. Today, for the sake of concision, I'm going to be referring to this dispersed event as the Rebellion or the Revolt. But this wasn't really a singular event. Rather, it was a wave of violence which swept across a vast swathe of northern India and which only ceased in 1859, some considerable time after the transfer of Indian administration from the East India Company to the British Crown and the concessions in August 1858, which led to a new model of indirect rule for India. How did communications technologies, and particularly the telegraph, what Marxists might call structures of mediating practice, contribute to creating the serial event of the rebellion of 1857? If, as Paul Virilio would have it, information is speed, how might we parse the events of 1857 in terms of speed and slowness, technological connection and social connectivity, the plugged and the unplugged. How far was 1857 a media event? Well, historians continue to argue about the causes of the 1857 rebellion, although it's patently clear that after 2 generations of British rule, levels of Indian disaffection were much greater than the colonial rulers had actually noticed. The proximate cause, that the sepoy troops rebelled because they were constrained to bite off cartridge caps that were greased with animal fat, beef or pork, prohibited by their religions, may have some foundation, but is certainly not an adequate explanation for the scale and strategy of a rebellion which spread very rapidly across North India, taken up by many civilians as well as soldiers. As Jenny Sharp says, this powerful cartridge fat myth of causality represents, in fact, quotes, the British effort to comprehend a native refusal of foreign rule where there should be consent. There are several competing macro explanations. The doctrine of lapse policy, brought in by Governor General Dalhousie, allowed the British to rob Mughal thrones from their proper Indian succession and caused a controversy in Britain, later referenced by both Wilkie Collins in The Moonstone and Anthony Trollope in The Eustace Diamonds. The grievances of small businessmen meant that many of the middling class of Indians became involved in the rebellion. Historian Eric Stokes sees the rebellion as, quotes, a mélange of rural revolts expressing little more than old rivalries deepened by economic stresses. But a more proto-nationalist explanation stresses the rebels' determination to extirpate totally all traces of foreign domination. Probably every one of these explanations has some traction. There were many competing scripts for the 1857 rebellion, and to the British this made the action seem incoherent, quotes, like a scattered patchwork of risings. A patchwork to the British, perhaps, but the gathering and relaying of grievances across vast areas of the country emerged as a serial sequence with order and significance for anti-colonial Indians, and represents the first large-scale movement towards an ultimately successful Indian nationalist campaign. Anti-colonial perceptions of connectivity, communication and infrastructure were different, and anti-colonial nationalism did not involve simply the modular reproduction of a Western model. Rather, it connected up spaces and people differently. In 1857 from the Indian side was a Gramscian war of position, a kind of political trench warfare waged on a number of different fronts. As Sarah Nuttall suggests in a post-colonial context, quotes, we might think of resistance as repair, producing circulations, and mending disrupted connections. Whether the Indian 1857 owed anything to the European 1848 is another matter for debate. Indeed, it's debatable as to whether the rebellion can be thought of as a revolution at all in the manner of those 1848 revolutions as, quotes, a certain number of actions to be executed in a certain order. Some British commentators speculated at the time about the contagion of European revolutionary ideas through print. One enraged army officer denounced a missionary shortly after the rebellion, saying, what the devil is the good of teaching the natives? He actually used a different word than natives, but I've substituted natives. Sir, you taught Nana Sahib, you did, and he learned to read French novels and to cut our throats. Eric Stokes found a parallel, a quote, parallel with 1848, a failed revolution. Rajat Kantarey has argued that 1857 was at once a traditional resistance movement and a movement unrecognisable to tradition. If 1857 represents the birth of a new political consciousness in India, it didn't generate the European 1848 demand for citizenship enshrined in a constitution. Rather, it mobilised an augmented sense of Indian cultural difference and a proto-environmentalist sense of attachment to the ground and to the traditional infrastructural social architecture of India. Christopher Bailey concludes that, quotes, 1857 was not a peasant rebellion in the sense of a rebellion for peasants as a class, but rather a rebellion of all those who were closely associated with the land. Forget about big things. Consider our small plot of land, measuring 6 acres and a third, writes Senapati in his satiric novel Kahmana Atagunta, or 6 acres and a third. In the 19th century, the small plot of land was the big thing for most Indians. What made 1857 really rhyme with 1848 was a failure of governance. The rebellion was perhaps partly a result of the automation of colonial communications, which took the British off the ground and sidelined local politics. The surveillance culture of the British Raj was increasingly focused only on the second-order data gathered by the regime itself. For both structural and cultural reasons, it's unlikely that the Indian insurgents were consciously adopting the revolutionary script of the European 1848, but unfortunately for them, the British were very swift to adopt the counter-revolutionary tactics and brutality that they had learned in those years. In 1846, an Act of Parliament in Britain had established the Electric Telegraph Company and reserved the right for the Home Secretary to take possession of the whole system for up to a week, if politically necessary. On the 10th of April 1848, the day of the monster Chartist rally at Kennington in London, the government was therefore able to obstruct the Chartist lines of communication from London to the provinces, where local Chartist leaders were waiting for orders to continue the action nationally. In 1854, the Governor-General of India, Dalhousie, had outlined the importance of connecting Calcutta with Benares, Allahabad, Agra, Ambala, Lahore and Peshawar, because in his judgment, these places were the most likely to harbour political resistance. The telegraph would guarantee, quotes, the earliest intelligence of any such occurrence, and within a few hours make known the orders, so that the several local authorities will be able to act with the same promptitude as if they were on the spot, end of quotes. And by 1857, over 6,000 kilometres of telegraph cable linked the major imperial centres in India. Karl Marx had warned in 1853 that England has broken down the entire framework of Indian society without any symptoms of reconstitution yet appearing. Consequently, he predicted that Indians would eventually turn the technologies that Britain had introduced into the country against their imperial rulers. But this was to happen much sooner than even Marx expected. So I'm going to talk now a bit about the punctual time of of empire. The electric telegraph has saved India, became famous as the pronouncement of Chief Commissioner of Oud, Robert Montgomery. On the 11th of May, 1857, Montgomery received a telegram sent from Delhi by signaller William Brendish, reporting on the emeute at Meerut the day before. The information was largely from bazar gup or gossip, but it enabled Montgomery and the commanding officer at Lahore to disarm the native troops and to flash a warning over the lines to Peshawar. It was reported, with very dubious credibility, in the British press that a sepoy soldier waiting to be hanged pointed to the overhead telegraph wire and lamented that, quotes, that is the accursed wire that strangled us. The telegraph was memorialised as a heroic object in the British counterinsurgent response, and the trope of the urgent telegram transmitted and received became central to the myth of the punctual time of empire. Rudyard Kipling's stories repeat but also displace the trope of the telegraph warning. In his The Bridge Builders, in which the British infrastructural project in India becomes the materialisation of empire itself, built plate by plate, girder by girder, span by span, a telegram, or tar, arrives for the chief engineer. Who's there? A shadow darkened the doorway and a telegram was put into Hitchcock's hand. Only a tar. It ought to be Raleigh's answer about the new rivets. Great heavens! Hitchcock jumped to his feet. The tar, or telegram, is a timely warning that the river is flooding upstream and will soon pose a risk to the new bridge. But here the tale veers into a different temporal register as Mother Gunga, the river, takes over, and through the offices of the Lascar engineer, Peru, Findlayson and his team enter into an opium-fueled conversation with the Hindu gods. And in Kipling's comic, racist and very offensive 1887 tale, His Chance in Life, the European Asian Michele de Cruz, a telegraph signaller on 35 rupees a month, works in the little sub-office of Tibasu, little sub-post office of Tibasu, which is really only a relay station. One day, there breaks out a nasty little riot, not worth putting in the newspapers. The telegraph signaller Michele was, for the moment, the government of India. He orders the village to defend the relay station with force, and as a result, he wins his promotion and transfer up country to the Central Telegraph Office. In truth, the telegraph did not save India for the British. Sepoy strategy in 1857 was very effectively concentrated on the destruction of telegraph lines and the burning down of telegraph offices or relay points. It was a rebellion organised along the relay system. Indeed, the rebellion can be mapped along telegraph routes, and the fighting intensified around relay nodes such as Shagati in Bihar or Mao near Indore. The telegraph office at Barakpur was burnt down almost immediately, and the telegraph line between Meerut and Delhi was the first to be destroyed. Consequently, when rumours circulated, quotes, while rumours circulated with the speed of electricity around the anti-colonial Indian community, official British news was obstructed and very slow to be confirmed. More than 1,477 miles of telegraph wire were destroyed in the uprising. Insurgent soldiers repurposed telegraph wires to make bullets and burned the telegraph poles as firewood. Wrought iron tubular telegraph poles were perforated and used as cannons. For many months, the insurgents routed the British. The telegraph system failed the British rulers and was an irrelevancy to the Indians. So if we ask when, not what, is an infrastructure, and we probably should ask when and not what is an infrastructure, because a technical system becomes an infrastructure only through its use, we can answer that telegraphy ceased altogether to be infrastructural during this period. Superintendent William O'Shaughnessy, returning to duty after the fighting, was to find the lines in the Northwest Province totally destroyed, as were the lines from Agra to Namanda, and all the signallers murdered or dispersed. By January 1858, he had fewer than 2,500 miles of functioning wire left and only 50 offices still in operation. So I'm turning now to a literary text, Rudyard Kipling's Kim. It isn't a question of weeks, it's a question of days, hours almost, said the elder. I've been expecting it for some time, but this, he tapped Mahbub Ali's paper, clinches it. Brogan's dining here tonight, isn't he? Send off those telegrams at once. The new code, not the old. Mine and Wharton's. We can settle the rest over the cigars. I thought it was coming. It's punishment, not war. In Rudyard Kipling's 1901 novel, Kim, we encounter once again the punctual digitized warning, which elicits a tough British response. But this incident in Kipling's novel merely glances towards the idea of some sort of non-specific mutiny, which will be easily put down by the British. And Edward Said is right to point out that Kipling almost entirely erases the 1857 rebellion from this late century novel. Only once does it appear as a kind of bedtime lullaby told to Kim by a loyalist Indian soldier. A madness ate into all the army, says the old soldier, and they turned against their officers. That was the first evil, not past remedy if they'd then held their hands. But they chose to kill the Sahibs' wives and children. And then came the Sahibs from over the sea and called them to the most strict account. But as a British commentator wrote from India, in the very same year that Kim was published, such loyalties were stretched increasingly thin by the end of the 19th century. Quotes, the native communities, stung with the new virus of political freedom, are stirring in feverish aspiration and beginning to think that one man is as good as another, and a good deal better. Said argues that Kipling's, quotes, profoundly embarrassing novel was written in full cognizance of this growing Indian national movement, but that for him, Kipling, it was India's best destiny to be ruled by England. I want to argue briefly today that there is a structure of relay in this extraordinary novel that complicates this reading a little bit without erasing it completely. Isabel Armstrong has noticed that Kim offers two parallel systems of, quote, seemingly antipathetic knowledges, which generate two forms of representation or figuring, approximating, she says, to Indian and British. But that oddly in the novel, quotes, the same thing can be interpreted as one or the other. I argue that the actual structure of the novel is at play in its meaning making, and not just its representational strategies. Kipling was not a novelist at all by nature. He preferred writing short stories, and Kim appeared in parts, serialized in the American McClure's magazine from December 1900 to October 1901, and almost concurrently in the British Castles magazine from January to November 1901. But the novel is serial in another way too, narrating a series of incidents that befall Kim on a journey. The organising themes of the Lama's search for his holy river of the Arrow and Kim's inauguration into the Imperial Survey of India as a chainman, as he's trained to gather information for the secret services, are also both serial plots. The river is an analogue geographical feature and the chain, the technique of imperial survey. And the novel is further organised by another connective technology, the Grand Turk Road, what the novel describes as a river of life, which runs right down India from Peshawar to Calcutta. Priyanka Ann Jacob has identified the novel's interest in speed and information, writing that Rudyard Kipling's Kim is a work that keeps its objects, people and information in almost relentless motion. But in truth, the motion is not constant in the book. Kim stops at regular intervals along the road to eat, to talk, to sleep. His relay stops punctuate the narrative. He joins the third-class passengers, quotes, sleeping in the waiting rooms of Lahore station. Another time he sleeps peacefully by the railway tracks, or he rests, quotes, squatting in the corner of a clanging railway waiting room. He makes the journey with his beloved Lama in stages, walking along the dusty road, quotes, until they reach the next halting stage, when evening found them at rest under the village tree of a mud-walled, mud-roofed hamlet, talking to the headmen as the cattle came in from the grazing grounds and the women prepared the day's last meal. Kim also regularly stops to eat. He bought sweetmeats in a leaf cup from a Hindu trader, or he enjoys rice and good curry. Much of the action of the novel is therefore embodied, structured around walking and wandering and everyday sustenance and subsistence. And these embodied, and I want to suggest analogue procedures, are slow, and the land across which they move is often represented as idyllic, quotes, golden, rose, saffron and pink, the morning mist smoked away across the flat green levels. They also take the train, which astonishes the Lama. I came hither in a T-rain. It goes swiftly. At first I was amazed to see those tall poles by the side of the road snatching up their threads. He illustrated the stoop and whirl of a telegraph pole flashing past the train. He admits that travelling in the noisy rail carriage is faster, but he also understands that imperial technologies inevitably miss the living Indian environment. Quotes, yet by going so in the terrain, we may miss the river, he says. The very structure of Kipling's novel models the move towards digital media, the media of computation and control, and it hints at the pain and the violence that this will bring through the chopping up of analogue experience and the disruption of continuities and flow. What digitization does is to render the world into binary code so that it is remainderlessly divisible into discrete bits, which is to say that it is per se accessible to the logic of conceptual definition and analysis. Kipling's Kim demonstrates the challenge of the digital to analog. Kipling's Kim demonstrates the challenge of the digital to analog experience, and therefore to a 19th century realist aesthetic as an obsolescent analog form invested in continuity, progress, growth, and organic embodiment and development. By contrast, second quote on the slide, the digital is a data technology that uses discrete, that is discontinuous values to represent, store and manage information. I suggest that Kipling's novel actively, although not necessarily intentionally, stages the relentless and compressive effects of seriality as it moves towards organizing information into digital form. By the end of the 19th century, literary fiction is finding it increasingly difficult to create ample grounds for its narratives. Instead, it seems only able to roll out a little bit of the road in front to create a series of temporary halting places. It has to move by relay. Kipling's attachment to India means that he hangs on hard to an analogue form of realism as he resists the reorganization effected by the digital. But the emerging digitality of the British imperial project repeatedly and insistently interrupts his analogue realist novel in the form of the telegraph wires strung throughout the text and the electronic messaging that clicks through its pages, such as the wire that Colonel Creighton receives at Simla from Lucknow, telling him that Kim has disappeared, or the terrified agent number E23 that Kim protects on a train, who fears that, quotes, all the wires will be out against me at Delhi. As a result of digitization, information is compressed, chopped up, segmented, and discontinuous. Kim is never able to see a continuous picture, but only a small portion of that vast mass of information received on which the Indian government acts. Mahbub Ali explains to him that the game is so large that one sees but a little at a time. Yet at the end of the novel, the Lama sees all Hind, from Ceylon in the sea to the hills. I saw every camp and village. The novel's attachment to realism becomes, perhaps contrarily, a form of insurgency that troubles Kipling and troubles his text. Throughout Kim, analog form resists the digital. For most of the novel, we see Kim spinning across India too quickly to ground himself. At the end of the novel, after his illness, however, he walks out of the village gate towards an empty bullock cart. The ground was good, clean dust, the hopeful dust that holds the seeds of all life. He felt it between his toes, patted it with his palms, and joint by joint, sighing luxuriously, laid him down full length along in the shadow of the wooden-pinned cart. The many-rooted tree above him, and even the dead manhandled wood beside, knew what he sought, as he himself did not know. Kipling is undoubtedly conservative, but there is a curious insurgency in his attachment to the dirt of India. This analogue and embodied India chimes with the nationalist anti-technological agenda that will soon develop into Gandhi's concept of satyagraha, or self-sovereignty, in his 1909 Hind Swaraj, in which cotton spinning and fasting become political acts of everyday resistance. Exhausted by his efforts for the British Empire, Kim unplugs himself and goes off-grid. He goes to ground beside a bullock cart, a cart which itself knows something of his plight, as does the tree. The ground engulfs him, and he becomes part of that ground. The inherent violence of the British colonial infrastructure has exhausted him, even erased him. So I'm concluding now. The international telegraph system of the 19th century was the beginning of the disappearance of the human into universal signal processing. One effect of the events of 1857 was to accelerate investment in undersea telegraph cabling as more secure for colonial communication. The telegraph cables were now largely resting on the seabed, unspooled on that great grey level plains of ooze where the Sherbird cables creep, in Kipling's own words. The British Colonial Office worked to telegraphically connect all the British colonies via all red routes, which meant all British routes, and by 1911 the all red system was complete, and over 70% of the world's cable was in British hands. Groundless. This is the definition from the Oxford English Dictionary. Groundless, destitute of foundation, authority, or support, having no real cause or reason, unfounded, having no basis or justification, groundless. If the telegraph was, as we've seen, a groundless technology of empire, it served to reveal, certainly to many Indians, the groundlessness of empire more generally. Machine intelligence that bypasses the human can heedlessly structure dangerous exclusions and equally heedlessly provoke violent action. The infrastructure of our world is now moving ever more rapidly away from embodied communication and towards digital signal processing and artificial intelligence. But if we can stay with the trouble that mediation brings, we might start to develop a more critical understanding of the racialized digitality within and through which we now exist. The imperialist military technological triumphalism of the 19th century has left a global legacy, which is material, environmental, and political. Never has it been clearer that technology is not only entangled with the environment, but actually is the environment, the techno-natural world that we now live in. The energy-hungry technologies which we rely on, and which themselves rely on the extraction and exhaustion of the Earth's resources, have created a climate emergency. As a result, we need to think about climate and sustainable development together, and we need to find modes of reopening, repair, and occupation for infrastructural sustainability and the more equitable distribution of new and cleaner technologies. Thank you. Finished.
Thank you so much, Professor Pettitt, for that most breathtaking talk. For those of us interested in the Raj and so on, there was a lot for us to connect with, and we'll now have questions from the audience.
Can I just ask you, can you see me now?
Yes.
Oh, good.
But
Okay. Well, maybe not good.
As well. If you would want, you could stop sharing as well.
Yes, that's what I was trying to do, but I'm sorry. As I said, I'm not very good at this system. How do I stop sharing? Let's see. Oh, stop presenting. Okay, maybe. It doesn't seem to. It's not something that you need to control, is it?
Not really.
No,
No.
okay,
You can just stop presenting. Yeah.
It just is not letting me do that. Hang on. Don't worry, we can start questions anyway, and I'll keep fiddling about with this.
Yeah, sure.
I manage
So,
it. I don't know why it's sort of not letting me do
yeah,
it.
sure.
Atul,
Roy
may I?
has a question. Please go ahead, Roy. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Professor Pettitt. That was, as Atul said, that was indeed breathtaking. Even though the talk was on colonial India, my question has to do with present day India. Like you said, connective technology, it needn't always be infrastructure, it can serve to oppress. So, the instance I want to point out is a very recent trend gaining traction in the Indian state of Kerala. So, prior to a wedding, the bridegroom to be, he gives the bride an iPhone, cutting edge
Wow.
technology. However, this is given as a symbol of his purchasing power rather than as an instrument for her social upliftment. It is also accompanied by expensive chocolates, which makes it seem more of a fancy toy than an actual tool. So, do
Yeah.
practices like these do they serve to deny women the benefits of technology while simultaneously giving them access to the cutting edge devices themselves? That was what I wanted to maybe discuss
Yeah,
here.
it's a good question. You mean the sort of positives of technology?
Yes, it looks positive because giving them the latest technology, but it actually serves to reinforce their position as subservient to the husband as provider, subservient to the male.
Yes. Yes, I mean, there's a whole other story about gender and technology, of course, which I wasn't really touching on much in this talk. Absolutely, no, that's really, I didn't know anything about that practice. Is it? It's a widespread practice, is it? It's not just one thing you saw.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
In one Indian state, it's becoming more and more popular. The trend.
That's very interesting. I mean, I suppose that there is there's a lot to say about that. I mean, it's a big difference, isn't it? Sort of from what I was talking about, which is a kind of imperial telegraph system, to an iPhone that you hold in your hand. And I'm interested in that as well. I mean, the sort of move towards personalized technology, which this is not. What I've been talking about is not that. But the move in I suppose, the sort of late 19th, early 20th century, and then very much in the 20th century towards personalized technology creates a whole other debate, I think. Obviously about who has it and who hasn't, but also about what it signifies, how we feel about it. It has a very different affect. And that's I mean, the fact that this is a wedding, it's a very affective situation. I'm interested. I didn't know this. It's interesting that technology is awarded a sort of a role in that situation, which is obviously a role about affect, as you say, also about control. So I think there's something I haven't really thought about very much yet about personalized devices. They don't happen much. I mean, the telephone is just coming in towards the end of the period of this book, but I don't get as far as don't really get as far as home computers, or I guess there are occasional. I'm thinking about Thomas Hardy, the Laodicean. There's a rich lady with a telegraph, her own telegraph system in her castle, in that. But I think kind of home technologies and personalized technologies are not really what I'm thinking about here. But tell me more. What do you think the connections are?
Professor Pettitt, I think that there's this confidence that even if we give them the latest technology, they don't have the they don't have the resource to use it for their own good. Which is a parallel that I see, the confidence with which the British would lay down the telegraph lines in India, saying these people, they won't know enough to disrupt them in time of war. That's one parallel that I saw.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. No, that's absolutely right. And I suppose also just, yes, the unforeseen consequences of technologies. Yeah, I mean, what we don't know about them when we first see them. I mean, heaven knows I've had trouble enough with my teenage kids. I mean, yes, we know that that people use technologies in ways that we don't expect and in ways that we don't necessarily approve of. Yes.
Thank you, Professor.
Shanton has a question. Please go ahead, Shanton.
I'm not hearing anything. Am I still connected?
You are.
Right.
In the meantime, we could probably have Afreen who had raised her hand. Please go ahead, Afreen.
Hi, Afreen.
Afreen, are you around?
Hello, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes, I can
Hello.
hear you.
At first, it's my privilege to hear from you. Thank you so much. It was a nice presentation. And
Thank you.
during your answer, I got my questions answered too. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Professor Pettit, I had a question, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, please go ahead.
It's not so much a question. I was wondering about the whole sense of there being this kind of an ignorance about India in the Anglo-Indian press of the Victorian age. I mean, the whole fact that the British were somehow ignorant of the. You mentioned the topography of India, and
Mm-hmm.
if I may quote from the very first issue of the Calcutta Review in 1844, it
Mm-hmm.
refers to, and I quote, whether Madras was in Calcutta or Calcutta in Madras, and entrusting to a Bengal cadet letters or parcels for parties at Bombay with strict injunctions to deliver them in person. Uh, so, so this is by John William Kay, who later went on to write a three-volume history of the mutiny and so on. So the
Yes, I
point
know
here
that. I know that history. It's rather worrying, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, and the whole point is that this theme of there being this ignorance about India amongst
Yes.
the British public
Yes.
is sort of it recurs in Anglo-Indian periodical essays. So I wonder why this was the case, whether it was to in one sense spur on the demand for periodicals and so on. So I am not sure why this was the case. So this is one question, and the other has to do with Kim. And you mentioned that whole, so to say, conflict about the analog and the digital in Kim, and the mention of the train and so on. At one point, there is a letter writer in Kim,
Yeah, there
whom
is.
Kim is and writes for him.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering how or whether the presence of a letter writer at a time when you had a more mechanized, more technologically advanced form of communication, what a letter writer does to that sort of a system. So these were my two questions. Thank
Great
you.
questions. Thank you. The first one is well, you know so much more about the Anglo-Indian press than I do, and I hope we're going to be able to talk about that more between us. Not on this call necessarily, but we should get in touch about that. I'm really interested by that quote from the Calcutta Review. Yeah, I mean, I'm struck by this too. I was really struck by I actually cut quite a lot about Gaskell. I had more about Gaskell's knowledge of India in the original paper, but it was too long. I was struck by her ignorance, though. I must say that she's as ignorant about North America. When the American Civil War starts, she's writing to Charles Eliot Norton, completely unclear about whether America has any cities in it or not, and whether it has forests and so on. So, and this is an educated person who reads. So it is somewhat sort of bemusing, really, as to just how geographically ignorant, and as you said, topographically ignorant people in Britain were about places that they actually had, whether they liked it or not, had government interests in. What you just made a passing remark that I thought was really interesting. You said something about maybe this was one of the reasons that the periodicals market grew, and I think that's really interesting. I think that, I mean, it's something I wrote about in my first book, is this kind of extreme appetite for information. And in fact, when the rebellion starts in 57, Gaskell makes a big effort to educate herself, and she writes about how they've bought a globe, they've bought maps of India, and they're reading lots of Indian history. So there's a sort of, they make a real sort of concerted effort, because her second child, Meta, is engaged to an Indian army officer who's stationed in Madras, and so they're worried about what's going on there. And in fact, then some of their friends are killed at Kanpur or Cawnpore, as it's anglicised as in the British press. So she does then become much more knowledgeable about India. But I think it's a really interesting question, and actually a question which I think, one could develop in interesting directions about just the lack of knowledge of the places that people feel that they own but don't know anything about. Yeah, it's a really good question. But I totally agree. That is exactly my impression too, is that people in Britain don't really understand where cities are in India or anything much about India at all. As for Kim, yes, the letter writer, who appears a couple of times, I think, is really interesting. I mean, there's a whole other, and it would probably be something I could connect to what I'm trying to say. There's a whole other discourse in Kim going on about literacy and semi-literacy and illiteracy, and the sort of the values of those things. Kim manages to trick the letter writer, doesn't he? I think he manages to not pay for the letter or something. I'm now remembering. I think that text and it is a novel which is really, really, really interested in mediation and communication, and it's a novel which, despite Kipling's conservatism, manages to de-hierarchize some of those modes of mediation. I would argue it's a dangerous argument. It's difficult writing about Kipling. I feel very uneasy about Kipling in many ways, but I think this novel is so interesting, and I think Isabel Armstrong agrees in her reading that it's a novel which is sort of written in the absolute kind of in the pinch, as it were. It's written it doesn't know what to do. It's written at a time when it's clear that Indian nationalism is taking off, and it doesn't know what to do with that. So it's interesting from that kind of perspective. I don't want to end up romanticizing kind of illiterate India, which I think Kipling does a bit, and I don't want to go down that route with him. But I think it's interesting that he wants to include all forms. He wants to include as many forms of communication as possible as he can in that book. And actually, what happens then is difficult. It's somewhat incoherent. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I just thought it was interesting that in one sense, Kipling's representation of India from below, so to say, I mean, the bazaars and the letter writers. And I mean, it is very rarely that you find, on the one hand, you have the reference to the train and the fairly sophisticated system of the empire. But on the other hand, you have that juxtaposed with a letter writer. And you have an Irish boy dictating to a letter writer, possibly Persian or Urdu. And that's something that very rarely happens. So that I found that fairly interesting and also intriguing. So
I think it is. You're right. It's rare, isn't it? Actually.
Yeah.
And I suppose comes from Kipling's actual. I mean, his childhood in India. I mean, he did know a bit about the country, and he certainly knew about Lahore. And so there is genuine sort of autobiography in there as well, I suppose. But no, I think that is a really interesting point. And in fact, I think Isabel Armstrong writes more about the letter writer in her article, which is well worth reading. It's a really good article.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks a lot. We have another question by Shayantan, who has a problem with his network, he said. So
he's texted
me his question. If you wouldn't mind, I'll just read it out.
Yeah, do.
This is Shayantan Lahiri, who is a PhD student here in the department. Thank you for the enlightening lecture. How do you think the introduction of the telegraph impacted the narrative time and movement in the genre of the novel in the 19th century? Do you see any overlaps or difference between the introduction of telegraph wires and the watches?
And the watch.
I think it's referring to the watch, the clocks.
Yes. Or maybe clocks. Yeah, well, I mean, yes, this is very much up my street. I'm really interested in time. And indeed, in other bits of this book, which is all a bit bitty at the moment, so I haven't quite pulled it all together, I'm going to be thinking absolutely about telegraphic time and the novel. I've written bits and pieces on this already, about Trollope, about Gaskell again, later Gaskell. So yes, I think it really does impact. In terms of creating this kind of fantasy of simultaneity, the idea that you can communicate at the speed of light is the usual sort of platitude that's used. And I think that does have a big effect on novel form. And it does actually start to, I mean, I've already argued in the 1848 book that we shouldn't read English industrial novels as English industrial novels. We should see them in a kind of European tradition of social, sort of radical social novels. And I think what happens with the Telegraph is that does begin to globalize, although I'm a little bit nervous of talking about the global because it always feels a little bit like I'm overstretching myself. I can't really be global. You will have heard how badly I pronounce my Indian words, so I'm not very global. But I think there's something really important about, I mean, there's a way in which suddenly different places can be thought of as somehow inhabiting the same ground in a new way, I think. So I'm actually, one of the things I'm doing, I'm trying to think about India, but I'm also trying to think about Brazil and Australia. So those three places I'm looking at in detail at the moment. And in all of those three places, I think telegraphic communication changes the relationship both ways between Australia and Britain, for example, and Britain and Australia. So a very big difference. I mean, clocks, I don't quite know what you mean, because they're coming pretty early. I mean, they're early modern, but maybe you mean sort of public clocks appearing, and because watches are very much a private possession. They're the kind of iPhones of the 18th century, I suppose, but by the 19th century there are public clocks for everybody to see. The kind of democratization of the clock, maybe, is what you're getting at. I suppose what's depressing, and it is a horribly kind of parallel to the internet, is that the telegraph starts as a great utopian fantasy of universal connectivity, and then of course falls very quickly, goes out of state hands quite quickly and into private hands, and becomes really a corporate, an apparatus for capitalism and under corporate ownership. So the great promise of kind of everyone being connected to everyone else doesn't happen. I feel like I'm rambling now. Is it possible to text a response to that, or is that tricky?
His chat box isn't working, what he said. There's an issue with the network, but thank you so much for... Yes.
Thank you for the question. It's a great question, and it's absolutely one of the questions I'm really trying to think about at the moment. So that's, would love to talk more about that when I talk more about that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And for a more formal vote of thanks, we have Professor Pramod K. Nair, the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies.
Professor Pettitt, that was truly amazing. I mean, the range you covered in 50 minutes.
I hope it was 50 minutes. I wasn't timing it, so I hope it wasn't horribly long. I'm sorry.
It was just right, and I think it fills quite a few books. The ideas you've given, all the way from the mutiny through Gaskell and Kim and the industrial novel, is absolutely amazing. For those of you who didn't quite get the introduction to Professor Pettitt, she's working on seriality in the 19th century, the long 19th century, and is one of the handful of scholars working in an emerging discipline, perhaps badly named the infrastructural humanities.
Yeah. So it's not very nice, that, is it? I don't like that infrastructure, but I know what you mean.
I didn't think you would. It seems like one more effort at showing the humanities does have an interest in science and
exactly, and we should not be doing that. So, I mean, we shouldn't be playing that game.
Especially terminology that comes like infrastructuralism. And
yes.
around now. But yes, I guess it's a kind of defensive, diffident stance to show that we also understand reading.
Yes. Exactly so. Yes,
so
absolutely.
Jennifer Wenzel's work has been amazing in that direction. Some of the stuff that she has done on electricity and post-apartheid South Africa. She spoke on the platform some time ago. Yes. So thank you all, and thanks to our usual Roy and Shantan. Thanks to my colleague and friend, Professor Anna Korean, and our PA, Atul, who arranges all this for us. But thanks above all to Professor Clare Pettitt. It has been a wonderful experience listening to you. Thank you so much, Professor.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
We'll let you know when the videos go up.
Thank you very much, and have a lovely evening. Thank you for coming, everybody. Thanks. I will try and get myself off this, or you might have to get me off. Oh no, I think I can do it. Okay. It was. I hope I will be able to meet you in person one day. I really do.
Sure, do. Sure.
Yeah.